both these guys said they were coming, so nobody else, they snooze to lose, right?
Okay, Roger, I have recording starting now, so.
All right, great. Okay. All right, guys, thanks for coming. Appreciate it. So right there, if you're obviously not on mute, but if you are on mute, you can use the space bar to chime in if you have a question. If I go too fast, or if you do have a question, just feel free to say, excuse me, jump in there. But otherwise, we'll have an opportunity at the end to kind of go over questions and interact a little bit. Okay. Being a small group, that's kind of a good thing for you guys. So if you're familiar with The Millionaire Real Estate Agent, that's the book that Gary Keller wrote. That's the red book. They call it the resource. And that's where we're coaching all of our coaching. So both of you guys are coaching clients. So that's where we're coaching right out of. So we're taking the models out of there and applying them in the coaching and passing them on to you guys. If you haven't read it, strongly urge that it's a good read. It's kind of interesting anyways. It would work for any business for that matter. It's not just for the real estate business. It would apply to a mortgage office and financial services business. A plumber could get something out of this. It's all about lead generation. In that book, we kind of reference functionary versus fiduciary. We're acting as real estate agents as fiduciaries. As you both know, you've both written offers. Brooke, you got one accepted. Taurus, I know you've written a couple. And sometimes it's a challenge to get the clients to make the appropriate offer, depending on what the existing market conditions are. Right now, we're in a up market, meaning prices are up and people are actually bidding over asking prices in some cases. And certainly they're being very competitive, and we're seeing multiple offer situations. So as a fiduciary in that respect, you're actually urging your clients, if it's in the best interest of them, to offer more than the list price when appropriate. You're trying to encourage them, but you're trying to show them and educate them and inform them that that's probably in their best interest. Otherwise, they may not get the house, or they likely, in some cases, not going to get the house because there are other people willing to pay more. On the flip side, on the functionary side, anybody can fill out an offer. It's really just more or less an application. Follow it through, fill in the blanks. But at the end of the day, sometimes you need to encourage people, and then there's some components of the offer, which are kind of important based on mortgage commitments and deposits and things of that nature, and asking for extensions. I always tell people, when in doubt, just go ahead and extend. If you're not sure, extend, send it over. You're protecting that deposit for the client if you're representing a buyer. And you're also protecting the brokerage for any liabilities and lawsuits in that sense, and of course yourself indirectly. Okay. So first things first, one of the first things you want to do if you're writing an offer, preparing an offer, and I think both of you have been coached on this, you've been told, go ahead and reach out to the listing agent, let them know there's an offer coming, give them a little bit of background, try to create and develop some rapport, play nice in the sandbox, so to speak. But just keep in mind, yes, you're starting and instigating negotiations, and they're negotiating, and you're negotiating on behalf of each client. You're representing the buyer. They're going to represent the best interest of the seller. Having said that, you would certainly be asking them a question. It would be a valid question. Have you received any offers, and do you have offers in hand is the key phrase to use, because you want to know if they've got an offer in hand, that's something that your buyer would want to know. If they indicate something else, oh yeah, we do, but we don't have anything, an offer in hand is more meaningful than, oh, we've got interested parties. Just keep in mind, take it with a grain of salt, communicate to your buyer, let them know what position they're in, if they're competing or not competing. That's going to help you in the sense that if you're asking them to make a competitive bid, let's say, for example, the price is $300,000 and they want to try $295,000. Mm-hmm. That's where that fiduciary conversation might come into play and say, well, you know what? They've got other offers in there. This is only 3 or 4 days into the listing. You may want to go in strong here and be at $300,000, or even kick it up above that and go a little higher if you really want the house. And then you try to take a litmus test of your client and see how much they really like that house and if it's really the house for them. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. And I think you've both experienced a little of that so far, right?
That's right.
Yep.
A
Yeah.
little bit. And then I think I have a transactional question.
Sure.
Because like, since I've only been on the buyer side, not the seller side, when do they have to actually present? Like, do they have 24 hours to present the offer as soon as they receive it? Because I mean, if it's a nice, the market, it's bananas right now, right? So folks are getting all kinds of offers. So do they usually like hold on till they have 5 and then present? Like, what's the SLA, or is it really, what's the rule of thumb?
So there's no real rule of thumb. Every listing agent's different. That's certainly, it's a great question, actually, when you think about it. That will come up in a little later too, as far as duration of offers as a buyer. When you're presenting an offer, you certainly want to give the opportunity to have some negotiations happen. So you want to give enough time for both parties, buyer and seller, listing agent, buyer agent, to communicate and get back and forth to each other. But they're required to present the offer within a reasonable amount of time. Based on licensing law. So having said that, for example, if I gave somebody an offer today and that listing agent said, well, I'm holding these offers for 48 hours, and they put you on notice to that effect, they certainly have let the seller know that the offer's here and I've got it and we're sitting on it, and they may even share the number with them.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as the seller is comfortable with that and the seller's given that instruction, then they're well within their rights. But they certainly have to let them know. They can't let you sit for 3 or 4 days and try to instigate other offers.
Okay.
Having said that, if you're expiring your offer early, that's the leverage you have. But at the end of the day, the seller just has to come back and give you a response saying, yeah, we're not interested in that offer as it stands right now. We're going to wait and see if we can collect some more offers. So does that answer your question, Brooke?
Yep. Perfect.
Okay, great. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so there's 4 components, as you both know. You've both done it. Obviously, the offer. Next would be the pre-approval letter. The next one would be the check. As you can see down there in the bottom left corner there, the check with blacked out the account numbers for obvious reasons. We don't want to be sharing that information over the internet with the way things are today. Somebody grabs that and steals that information, goes and cleans out your client's account because of an email that you sent. You could just have to keep in mind, you could be held responsible for that if they could prove that was the case, because you're supposed to protect the best interest of that client, being a fiduciary in that relationship. Also, in the memo section of the check, the bottom left corner there, you're putting the property address in there. And that's just so if that check's floating around in an office and they're waving around, hey, who knows whose check this is? They can at least know which deal that goes with. And I also kind of instruct too to throw the listing agent's name in there too as well, because I don't know if you've noticed that every now and again we're getting checks and we're firing out an email to everybody going, who knows this property address, whose deal is this? So if the listing agent's name is there, then they can also trace that down. Okay. And then the 4th one would be your agency disclosure. That's identifying you as the agent representing the buyer and the capacity that you're in, meaning the buyer's agent. So that way the seller sees that and all parties know who's being represented by who. Those are the 4 required documents that every listing agent is going to be looking for. And if those 4 components are there, then you're doing your job.
Roger, can I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead, Taurus.
Is the disclosure kind of same thing as a contract, or that's completely different?
That's a great question. I like that. Thank you for asking. That's a good question. So, and this is something would be interesting to you guys as buyer's representation, trying to get buyers to sign a buyer's agreement to agree to work with you. So you have some sort of agreement. So, you're not just out in the wind.
Mm-hmm.
Agency disclosure is by mass law. It's required by mass law. And I believe they have the same understanding in Rhode Island. And Brooke, you could acknowledge that if you know better. It's just disclosing who you are in the transaction to the consumer who you're working with. So in our example here, this would be identifying you to the buyer as their buyer's representation. And if you read the back of the sheet, it would explain to you what your responsibilities are. And one of those big responsibilities is you're acting as a fiduciary. So in other words, you're taking responsibility saying, hey, I'm going to protect your deposit. I'm going to protect your best interest. I'm going to be advising you with respects to your best interest, not mine. And it's not a requirement that it has to be signed, but you are required by mass law to at least present that to anybody that you speak to in any relationship with respects to real estate on your first meeting, face-to-face, or generally speaking, even over the internet. If you were doing a Zoom call with somebody, that would be the first document that you should have them at least acknowledge seeing and showing them. And it's just explaining to them how you fit into the relationship. Does that answer your question, Taurus?
Yeah, but so, I mean, it's kind of off topic, but a contract, is there like a form that I can just get from KW, or how would that work?
The agency disclosure?
No, like a contract, like a seller's contract, but like a buyer's contract.
A buyer's agency, yeah. So in DocuSign or .loop, depending on what you're using, it's called a buyer's agreement. Call it, for lack of a better word, listing agreement. It's a buyer's agreement between you and him. And all it is, it's a listing agreement between the agent and the buyer. But I can, can send you a copy of that.
So if that person goes ahead and buys the house with somebody else, I should still be kind of paid for that transaction?
At a minimum, you would have some documented proof that, yes, you were working together with that person. But that would be that's a good question to ask, and we could set you up and you'd ask your attorney to kind of read it. It depends on what the agreement says. And it also, if you read kind of between the lines of those agreements, as long as you're maintaining contact with that client and email proof, text mail proof, phone calls but if you abandon the client and don't speak to them for 3 months and they go out and buy a house with somebody else, that contract's not going to hold up, because they're going to say, you broke that chain, you abandoned that client. So it's kind of a gray question, and it's not an easy question to answer without context. But as long as you were working with them, say, for example, you took them to an open house or sent them an email, said, hey, go check out this house. And they go check the house out, and they come back to you 2 days later and go, hey, we bought that house. And you've got a buyer's contract with them. You'd have at least a very, very strong argument of procuring cause to present to that listing agent to force that listing agent to pay you.
So would you recommend to get that contract signed when working with a buyer?
I would. It's our KW's policy that if you're working with a buyer, you should have one of those signed.
Okay.
In some cases, it's not, you don't have to have it signed to get paid either. So if you didn't have one signed and you were the procuring cause, and you could still get paid on that. But our policy is to have one of those signed, and it's to protect your interest, let the buyer know what their obligations are, and obviously clearly to protect the interest of the brokers. Okay. We can talk more about that too in a one-on-one too, Taurus.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. So the next two documents, not necessarily required, if applicable, is in Massachusetts, and I believe also in Rhode Island, is the lead paint law kicks in. So lead paint disclosure, I recommend you read the law. It seems long, but it's not. But the gist of it is, if you as a buyer buy a home with lead paint in it, the seller's not obligated to disclose that there's lead paint unless they know about it. If they don't know about it, they're going to check the box saying unknown. They're disclosing, we don't know if there's lead paint here. We don't have any documentation if there's lead paint here. And then you're buying it and you're checking those boxes, acknowledging the fact that they don't know. They have instructed you that they don't know and you don't know. If you want, you can certainly feel free to go ahead and check for lead paint. Or there's a link down there as well that is a buyer's agent, or if I was a buyer and I wanted to double check just to confirm, because maybe the seller bought the house and nobody disclosed anything to them, but there might be a report out there floating around, it would be logged with the Massachusetts lead paint agency there. And you can see the link down the bottom left corner. You could just go in there and find out if they have any, because that's where it's going to wind up. So if there's a lead paint report produced by a licensed lead paint specialist, they're sending that report into the state, just for an FYI. So that would be.
And if there's a child under 6, do you have to get test the lead paint? Nope.
It's just the law requires us to disclose whether we know there's lead paint or not lead paint.
But they don't have to get test. Yeah, they don't have to do the test.
There's no requirement that you have to test it. No.
Okay.
But it's a great question to bring up here. So just keep in mind, if you read the law, the property transfer notification, it will tell you that if you buy a house that has lead paint in it and you own it now, and it's a 6-year-old, or under, or your niece or nephew's over and you're sanding walls down and that child gets lead paint poisoning, you could be held liable for that, and be actually, brought up on child neglect laws as far as putting that child at risk because you did something knowing there was lead paint there and you did something like that. And now, had that kid get exposed as well on your watch, so to speak, now you could also be forced to de-lead the property because that child lives in that property. But it's pretty clear in the law that what the consequence would be. But to sell a piece of property, you're just only required to disclose what you do know about the house. And this document needs to be filled out. And if it's not filled out, there's heavy fines as well to the agent. And, so just keep that in mind. It's something to take kind of seriously. Just do it and you're protected. Also keep in mind, if you're listing a property, that document to be in compliance technically in Massachusetts should be attached to the listing so that when that buyer looks at that property, they can look and they can go right to that attachment and see if it's, if somebody's disclosing whether or not there's lead paint there or not, if they know, if they don't know. So
And that brings up a good question for me when I'm looking at properties and disclosures are not on the listing.
yeah.
Isn't that required when you're posting a listing in general? Like, don't you have 24 hours to make sure they're up there?
Same for me.
Yeah. I mean, if you're to be in compliance with the law, you're absolutely correct, Brooke. In some agents don't get them on there and they're being a little reckless and loose with the law. But generally speaking, it's going to be presented to you sooner or later by the time of the offer. So when you're writing the offer, technically, if you're a buyer's agent and that document's not, if that house is built before 1978, you're having your client fill that document out right there and presenting it back to the seller and asking them to fill out the other half. But you're right. It's a great question. And a lot of agents are laxed on that. And some agents probably don't even realize they're supposed to be doing that, to be quite honest with you. But it's a policy of ours at Keller Williams that if you have a house built before 1978 and you're listing it, that document should be attached to the listing at, within 24 hours of you posting it. So, and that's a good point too. Keep in mind when you post a listing, I believe that you can't really attach it until after you actually post it. So that would be why some people might forget to do it. But yeah, great question, Brooke. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, the other item here is the seller's statement of property, and that's the seller's disclosure form. That's where the seller's disclosing anything they might know about the house that might be relevant, that's a buyer would like to know. Simple things like age of roof, how old's the furnace, did you do any work in the house? If you did you pull permits and things of that nature? Keep in mind this document's filled out by the seller. You do not fill it out as the agent. You don't make any alterations of it. It's the seller's document to the buyer. So once it's signed, if you see a mistake, you can certainly instruct and consult and advise your seller that, that might be a mistake. You might want to fill that out properly and then make the adjustment there. But you can't don't cross something out and make a correction, because if you do something like that, you own it. That make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide. Okay, a couple other items here. So something that can benefit in a transaction, if you're making an offer on a property and your buyer's like a little anxious and wants to kind of influence the seller, or is there anything I can do to better my offer here? You could certainly encourage them that they could write a letter to the seller from the buyer, kind of telling them a little bit about themselves and their family, things of that nature, and also letting them know what they love about the house. In some people's opinions, this could be counterintuitive. That like, why would you want to give up leverage, so to speak, there? But keep in mind, we're in a competitive market, and this is if the buyer really wants the house, and maybe they can't go as high as they wish they could, and as far as value, but they do want to influence and ask for some sway and some consideration from the seller to why they're making a lower offer. It might be, for any reasons. And sometimes there's an emotional component with some sellers that, they want to sell their house to somebody they like, so a nice letter written, flattering the seller, telling him, we love how you maintain the home. We can see the care of it. We know it's your family home that, maybe they've been there for 40 years. There might be a little bit of an emotional attachment, and just telling the seller, we're going to take care of it and love it like you did. There are times where I've seen that be effective, and sellers have said, geez, you know what? I like those folks. I want to go with those folks. Having said that, the offer still has to be pretty competitive if it was a competing offer, but it's not hurtful, that's for sure. It can't hurt to throw it in there. The other one there is proof of funds. That's in a case of maybe you're making an all cash offer. So the seller is going to want to see, and the seller's agent is going to want to see that you have the proof of funds plus closing costs. So for example, you're making a full price offer, proof of funds. I'm offering you $300,000 cash. I need about $306,000 probably, or a little more, to close for closing costs. I'm going to show them proof of funds that I have at least $310,000. And that would come as either a letter from the institution where you have the funds, or you could show them a bank statement. Again, blacking out the account numbers, and all they're seeing is the institution's names, the buyer's name there, and the balance. And you can cover up all the detail of the document. They don't need to see the details of the checking account, so to speak. They just need to see the balance to know that they have enough money in there. Okay, this is just a little summary. The 4 important documents are the obvious: the offer, proof of funds and or pre-approval letter, a copy of the check, and the agency disclosure. Those are the 4 that you need. And then obviously, if applicable, lead paint, and then the agency disclosure form. Not agency, I'm sorry, the seller's statement of property. All right, this is the part that gets a little tricky with people, and they get a little nervous over it. Making a strong offer is something that a fiduciary is going to try to do. So in this market being an up market, next slide, please. You would be counterintuitive, but everybody's always looking for the best dollars. The more money, the more sway you're going to have with a seller. But it's not always necessarily going to be the case. In some cases, when somebody's a little overpriced, you may be trying to negotiate. But in this market right now, people are bidding at least list prices, and in some cases over list prices, and they're being very competitive, and we're running into multiple offer situations. Having said that, you're trying to encourage your client to put in the best price. So Taras, you've had a few situations where you've had to kind of try to sway, and your client didn't want to come up, but at the end of the day, it's his choice. And we're always kind of going back to, what do you love about the house? And if you want this house, you may have to consider going up higher than the list price. Or when we get into a situation where we get a best and final, for an extra few $1,000s, would you be disappointed if somebody else bought this out from under you? And if their answer is yes, then you'd shrug your shoulders and just look at them and say, well, if that's the case, then that's the offer that I would suggest you make. The next one's obviously up to 5% of the purchase price would be what you'd want to be offering, in a sense, on the deposit earnest money. Don't confuse that or conflate that with the actual down payment money at the closing. But at the purchase and sale, we're going to put $1,000 down with the offer to bind the offer. And then when we move forward after home inspection, we're going to put up to 5% down with the purchase and sale. Having said that, if the client doesn't have the full 5%, then certainly it can be less. And it could certainly be more if they're trying to strengthen their offer. In other words, show that commitment to that seller. Hey, listen, I'm serious. I'm not going anywhere. I'm buying your house. You could certainly go over, but we're only going to look for up to 5%. And we're not going to risk more money unless we feel there's a leverage play there for us.
That 5% is part of the down payment eventually, right?
It will be part of the down payment, but it's not necessarily the full down payment. In some cases it is, but for an example, if somebody's putting 20% down, they're not going to put 20% down at the purchase and sale. They're only going to put the 5%, and they'll bring the additional 15% to the closing table. Good point.
what's the minimum? Is it 3.5% for like a conventional loan? Do you know? Just
So a conventional minimum, my understanding, and there are some programs that will go down as low as 3. Conventional minimum is 5%.
5. Okay.
Then you've got FHA, which will go down as low as 3.5%. And you do have some programs that will go down as low as 3%. And then you do have the programs like VA programs where they'll literally do 100% financing. Having said that, you're still going to have to put some money down to let the seller know that you're serious. You got to put some skin in the game, so to speak. Otherwise, you've got no risk. I could just walk away, and I have no harm, no foul. But the seller took the house off the market. They're not going to do that unless you put some money down.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome, buddy. So the next one there is contingencies. Less is more in this case, but we're always going to have at least 2 contingencies. Generally speaking, the home inspection contingency is going to stay and the mortgage contingency is going to stay. The only time you'd let those slide is if the buyer is instructing you that they want to waive it. And if it's a buyer that's a contractor type person, very handy with their hands, and he's in the business and he's like, yeah, I don't need a home inspection. Or if it's something that you want to put an impression on the seller that, listen, we don't need a home inspection. We're buying this with cash. And it doesn't matter. We're tearing the house down. They wouldn't necessarily need a home inspection. Okay. The mortgage contingency, and Brooke, you had an experience with this, that you're doing a mortgage in your property. You would never waive that, because if you can't get your financing, you're stuck and you'd lose your deposit at the end of the day. Having said that, there are instances if somebody's making a cash offer, they're going to waive their mortgage because they're obviously not having a mortgage. Okay. Again, there we go with the pre-approval letter. What's a strong pre-approval letter? That would be one that's already been underwritten, that maybe some banks, that's all they'll issue. And it's almost as strong as a commitment letter, where they've looked at all the documentation, they've pulled credit and things of that nature for the buyer. Also a local mortgage originator, somebody that's known in the area, will help strengthen your offer up. In some senses, like a Quickens loan type of company. Some listing agents look at that and they just, they're just weary of it because you're talking to somebody out in Colorado. There's nothing wrong with them, but if they know the mortgage officer in the area and it's written by a specific name in this area that people recognize and know, they know the character and credibility of that mortgage officer, that will give you sway in some listing agents' eyes. Having said that, read those because they are important. You'll see things. You'll know if you read them, if it's been underwritten, so to speak. You'll know that it'll tell you if they've pulled their credit, generally speaking. And if you have questions on those things, and as a buyer's agent, you should have some sort of communication with that mortgage originator as well, the mortgage officer, just to kind of share information back and forth with what you understand the buyer situation is and what they understand the buyer's situation is, so that you're on the same page.
Is that before or after, you've submitted an offer on their behalf? Like, do they say, okay, I've gotten pre-approved. Are you like, let me see this, and then just do a courtesy call just to CYA?
So if you're talking to your buyer, and one of the first thing you're going to have them do is get them pre-approved. So you're either referring them into a mortgage originator, or they've already got one. You certainly want to have a conversation because it's part of your pre-qualification process of that buyer's credibility. So you should have a good working relationship. For example, here's a perfect example. If it's a Quickens Loans type of pre-approval, what kind of communication do you have? They'll take your call, but it's a little more convenient for us, convenient for your buyer, and reassuring to the local community of agents in the area if that person's local. In other words, they're working here out of Massachusetts, so we know that they know Massachusetts law, they're familiar with Massachusetts markets and things of that nature. So yeah, I would have a conversation. I'd urge you to have a conversation and create a little bit of a relationship with whoever their mortgage officer is. What's that?
That's Quicken Loans.
Oh, I'm not.
I have one
I'm
of
not
those.
poo-pooing on Quicken Loans. There's nothing wrong with them, but for obvious reasons, you can see. Thanks.
Yeah. It says Detroit. Yeah.
Right. You're over there going, what? Yeah. I'm not suggesting they're bad. I'm just suggesting that it just gives you a little bit more sway and a little more weight in the area.
Makes sense.
Okay, Brooke, did that answer your question?
Yep, it definitely did.
Perfect. Let's see, the next one's rehashing of the buyer's letter, again, stroking the ego, so to speak, of the seller, and you also want to know that that information's getting to the seller, because if this is part of an offer, a listing agent is obligated to at least bring it to the attention of the seller. And then the other one there is being flexible with a closing date, and asking in that first conversation that you have with the listing agent, ask that listing agent, hey, are there any particular dates that is important to the seller here? They might be moving and they might want a closing date that's a little further out than normal or a little tighter than normal. So it would behoove you to try to be as close to that closing date as possible, because that's going to put some sway in the seller. Hey, this person can accommodate our closing date. For example, maybe you've got a buyer that's in a rental that's a month to month, so there's no pressure for that buyer to have to close on a specific date. They certainly want to kind of close towards the end of the month, so they're not paying extra rent. But if they were willing, because they want their offer to kind of go to the top of the pile, if they were willing to be flexible on that, that would be important to a seller. Okay. So the 6 important dates coming up. And the first one is the offer duration. I think, Brooke, you might have alluded a little bit to this as far as, timing and things of that nature. There's nothing set in stone. You can make this offer expire in an hour. You can make it expire in a week. Having said that, if it expires in an hour, you're just telling the seller, hey, hurry up, you're putting a gun to their head. They're not necessarily going to appreciate that. And to be quite honest with you, any good listing agent's just going to kind of ignore that date anyways. They're going to tell you, yeah, we're going to hold all offers for 24 hours at a minimum to see, we've got showings coming in tomorrow. So if you need an answer in an hour, we're going to say respectfully, not at this point. We're going to wait till tomorrow type of thing. Having said that, 12 to 48 hours is a window that's reasonable. Certainly 12 hours, but 6 hours is enough. In some cases, if you're doing investment properties and you're dealing with an institution, maybe it's a bank-owned property, they don't work on the weekends, so you're definitely not getting a response over the weekend. And they generally will instruct you in the listing to give them up to 3 to 5 business days to respond. And it just is what it is. So when you write your offer, make sure you're giving them enough time. Otherwise, the listing agent is going to push it back into you anyways. And or the institution on the other side, when they get back in the office, they're going to look at that and go, this is expired. We need this updated before we'll consider it. Next is within 10 days of the signed offer, meaning if the sellers signed the offer on the 5th, you're going to do your home inspection within 10 days of the 5th. So that will be the 10th. They do home inspections on the weekends, so that wouldn't necessarily matter in that respect. And you also have to do the home inspection, process the information, and respond back to the seller whether you're moving forward or not before the 10th. If not, you'd have to be signing an extension in that case. And those forms are in .loop or in DocuSign as well. The next date would be within 14 days to the person's sale. So you're giving the time to do the home inspection, digest the information, and also certainly if there's a lawyer involved going to prepare a purchase and sale, you can give them a few days to get that purchase and sale pulled together and communicate with the other side's lawyer as well. So they're going to need a few days. So we go out within 14 days. Again, you can go out a little further, pull that entire, depending on the situation. And on these, keep in mind, don't have a purchase and sale date on a weekend because lawyers generally don't work on the weekend and or a holiday for obvious reasons.
Sorry, Roger.
Yep.
So I missed 14 days. That's after the offer was accepted?
After the signed accepted offer, yep.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If people drag their feet and they're negotiating over 3 days, squabbling over price for whatever reason, and you're dated on the 15th and you burn 3 days of time negotiating back and forth, and now you're at the 18th, you want to go 14 days from the 18th, and you would probably at that time anyways be rewriting and changing the dates there anyways. So you just have to give it time. You got to give yourselves time to get the home inspection done, scheduled. When it's really busy, home inspectors, they're scheduling things 5 to 7 days out. In some cases you might be able to get one pretty quickly, but not in a normal busy environment. And then the same with the lawyers. You got to give them time to process the information and pull pulled together the purchase and sale, circulated around, get the other lawyer to sign off on it, review it, and that can take several days in some situations. And it can come around, turn around quickly too, but if you don't want to be signing extensions all day or all the time, give yourself enough time, a little cushion there. And again, don't do those things don't have the purchase and sale date on a weekend because the lawyers they're not necessarily working.
I have a question here because I've heard that if you, and I've done buyer side again, so but mostly in Rhode Island, I've yet to do something in Mass yet.
Yep.
That when you have an accepted offer, you leave it to the seller's agent to write up the P&S. Is that the best practice, or is it really just whatever feels most comfortable for you?
So it's generally speaking, you're absolutely correct. It's a great point. So in Rhode Island, as you know, you go right to purchase and sales. You don't do an offer. In the home inspection contingency is baked right into the purchase and sale. Whereas in Massachusetts, we have an offer stage with home inspection, mortgage contingencies.
Mm-hmm.
Then we do the home inspection. Then we have a purchase and sale signed. I just slipped my mind what your question was.
Who writes the P&S?
Oh, yeah. So the purchase and sale is typically done by the listing side. So the listing agent would produce the purchase and sale. If there's attorneys involved, go ahead and ask the attorney to go ahead and prepare the purchase and sale.
Okay.
And, so for example, if the seller has an attorney, the attorney will produce it and they'll send it back, and then that'll get shared with the buyer's attorney. Have I seen buyer's attorneys prepare purchase and sale? Yes. At the end of the day, they're just both reviewing each other. They're going to add their addendums on to the end of it. They're going to strike out what they don't like, and the attorneys will go back and forth and come to a conclusion and come up with. But yeah, good question. It's the listing side that'll produce it. I think I answered that one right. All right. The application for the mortgage is generally already done most cases because they've already got a pre-approval letter. But what we do is we'll give them 48 hours after signing the purchase and sale. And then the next one's the mortgage contingency date, and we'll go between 21 and 30 days after the signing of the offer. That obviously gives the underwriter and the lender time to underwrite the loan and get to the mortgage commitment. And obviously, again, there's another one where you don't want to have that fall on a weekend or a holiday for obvious reasons. And then we move into the closing date, which would be 30 to 45 days. And again, don't let that happen on a weekend or a holiday for obvious reasons. And we try to keep those off of Fridays in case something goes wrong on a closing. Funds get tied up for whatever reason and it doesn't close that day. At least we have the following day, Friday, to get it closed. And we don't have to carry somebody over a weekend. Another good point with closings too is don't necessarily do it at the end of the month. Try to do it maybe several days prior to the end of the month or towards the beginning or the middle of the month for a simple reason. Everybody's trying to hit the end of the month. The lawyers are very busy. The lenders are very busy. And it just, there can be a backlog, and the likeliness of a closing getting pushed is a little higher towards the end of the month. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it just helps the industry as a whole. If we spread these things out over a month, things happen and move along faster. Okay, just a reminder here. Again, with the weekends, right? That makes sense to everybody. So now we're going into, I call them 12 situational clauses, but there are certainly more than 12. There could be as many as whatever situation arises that you might put a clause into an offer. And moving forward, here's an opportunity. If you were thinking about writing a situation clause, you'd say, where am I going to put that? In most cases in the form, in our form, I believe it's either 8 or 9, Sarah. No, she might be muted. But so right down here in additional terms or additional provisions, it might say that in some of the documents. That's where you'd write your additional provisions or additional situation clauses. Next slide. There we go. Okay. The most commonly used one is they call it a buyer's inclusionary clause. That's when they're asking for a washer and dryer or a fridge. So those items are not affixed or a fixture of the house, because you can certainly unplug them and just take them with you. A fixture in the house would be something similar to the stove, which is hardwired to the house, or a dishwasher, which is hard plumbed to the house. Those would be considered fixtures. Light fixtures wired to the house, those are things you wouldn't have to ask for. But if somebody saw something, for an example, there was a stove insert in the fireplace, don't assume that's staying. You would write that right into your offer as an inclusionary clause. So it would read something like this. A lot of times I just say, when in doubt, write it out. So if you're not sure, you're not going to get yelled at because you wrote something, so nobody's going to call you. And it's, oh, that's attached to the house. Of course that's staying. Just go ahead and write it out. Swing set in the backyard, include that in the inclusionary clause, because they could be taking the swing set. So if the buyer's interested in it, go ahead and write it down. The next one there is buyer's closing cost credits. That will be if a buyer doesn't have sufficient funds necessarily to put a deposit down, and they need some extra cash, maybe to pay for closing costs. You could write that in as a buyer's credit. We'll see some language coming up here soon, but I just want you guys to be aware of them. Another big one right now is the escalation clauses. So in competing offer situations, that's an example of, say the house is on the market for $300,000 and your buyer says, geez, I would offer him $310,000, but I don't really want to. And I don't want to feel like I'm overpaying for the house. That would read like this. It'd be, my buyer is willing to offer you $300,000 or $1,000 over your best forget the word. What's that?
Best offer?
Well, your best offer, but it would be an offer that they can prove. They're going to show the offer. It's like, it's not just like they say, oh yeah, we have an offer over that. The name's eluding me, but that would be that case, and then up to $310,000. So I'll go up to 310 as long as you can show me a bona fide offer that says you got an offer of 309, and then I would match it up to 310, and then after that you're out. Does that make sense? You guys got any questions around that one? Because that sometimes can be confusing.
All good for me.
Okay.
Yep, makes sense.
All right. Okay, and there's several here. So 48 out. If you have questions, go ahead and read these. I won't go over them one at a time, but home selling contingencies are there. That's if a buyer has a home to sell, you need to identify that they have a home selling contingency. 48-hour first right of refusals is in a situation where maybe you have a seller that doesn't want to take their house off the market. Your buyer wants to make them an offer, but they have a home selling contingency baked in. And the seller says, yeah, we'll entertain that. We'll take that offer, but we don't want to take our house off the market. There's some language for that, and so on. If you want to go to the next slide too, Sarah. If you see one, you have a question, just go ahead and ask me. There's an appraisal clause there. These aren't required, but these are just things to put in to an offer if your buyer wanted to be more comfortable with something. But certainly you're required if you're selling a house and you want to, if your buyer is buying a house and they have a home to sell, you'd be required to put that in there to protect the deposit. Unless they tell you for some reason they don't have to sell the house, then that will be a case where you might drop that.
Can you provide an example of an appraisal clause? I mean, I have a sense of what that may be in my head, but I think one of the things that I think about is, how hot the market is and what people are pricing these homes at versus what the bank is actually going to appraise them at. And I think that sometimes there can certainly be a disconnect between what it'll appraise for and then what it's actually listed for.
You know what, Brooke? I love the way you phrase your questions. It's awesome. So yeah, that's a great question, because so here's an example where you'd put one of those in there. That would be if your buyer's afraid of the appraisal, meaning, yeah, I don't mind offering that number, but you know what? If it doesn't appraise, I want to be allowed the opportunity to revisit that. So here's an example. We use 300,000 again. Let's say meeting in the minds, they're at 275 and that's what they're offering. And a buyer overbids and says, I'll take it for 300,000. But they're only putting minimal money down. a listing agent's going to look at that as a very weak offer if that appraisal clause shows up. It's already kind of inferred that it's in there because, to be quite honest with you, their mortgage contingency would likely cover it, because if they can't get the funding, they can't buy the house. But here's a case of maybe somebody's offering cash and they say, I just want the opportunity to revisit this. So I'm offering you cash 300. The seller's insisting on getting that 300. And we're trying to use comps to justify our offer, and they're just being arrogant about it maybe for some reason. If you put that in there, that protects your buyer to at least, if it does not appraise for that 300, that they could say, all right, I'm pulling my offer back. Now the seller could ask you to pull it out. They won't accept your offer that way too, which would be pretty standard as well. I hope I'm getting to your answer.
Yep,
your question.
you are.
Yeah. So it's one of those things. It's really not something that listing agents like to see, or sellers for that matter.
Okay.
But sometimes it'll just make a buyer kind of move forward a little better. And if it does appraise, they'll feel a little more comfortable. And if the seller's pretty confident that it'll appraise, and the seller's agent, there's no reason why they should be uncomfortable with it. So they may let it fly because, you know what? Yeah, it'll appraise. And even if it appraised, doesn't mean, if it didn't appraise, doesn't mean the seller has to reduce their price or do anything. It didn't appraise. That's fine. You offered me 300. That's what I want. So you'd have to come up, the buyer would have to come up with that difference to execute. Or they could have a meeting of the minds and negotiate, maybe split the difference. Or the seller in a weaker market where it's a buyer's market, the seller would say, fine, I'll take it. I'll let it go for the appraised value.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Brooke?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for asking. That was a good question.
So it's a quick question, Roger.
Yep, go ahead.
So what if you can't put any more money down and you didn't put this appraisal clause? Because like if it's appraised at 250 and you offer in 300, you have to pay the difference, right? Out of pocket pretty much to get that loan.
That's right. The lender's going to loan you on the appraised value. So
yeah, but what if you don't have the extra 50 grand to put down?
Right. If the buyer can't come up with it, then the likeliness is the lender's going to reject that buyer at the mortgage commitment time. So if it doesn't appraise, they're going to deny that loan.
Okay. So that's going to fall back onto the mortgage contingency.
Right.
Okay.
That's my general understanding, but that would be a great question if you have an attorney. Certainly always ask. Remember that we're not, as collective agents, we're not attorneys, so we shouldn't advise on language and things like that. That would be something I would defer to an attorney. But that's my general understanding. That if the lender denies it based on the mortgage because the buyer can now not afford it because they don't have the money to make up the difference between that appraisal and what the seller wanted, that would kill the deal based on that contingency. Having said that, the seller could step in and say, hey, you know what, we're into this for 30 days. We've got commitments we want to move. We'll reduce the price. So it doesn't necessarily have to kill the deal, but it could. And then that mortgage contingency would likely kick in there. But good question, Paris. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
Next. Okay. So here's a few other clauses. The one in the middle there, the condo docs, that would be a standard clause if you're looking at condos and maybe the condo docs are not attached, which in my belief, I think they should be attached to the listing. So it's kind of easy for everybody to kind of scrutinize them. But, if you didn't get to see him, your client hasn't seen him, you're making an offer and maybe they have a dog and they want to make sure, and everybody said, yeah, dogs are fine, but you haven't seen it in writing yet. That would be just protecting your interest, your buyer's interest, by saying, hey, listen, this is offers subject to the buyer's satisfactory review of the condo docs. And the seller shouldn't be afraid of that. That's a standard anyways. It's usually going to be a requirement of the transaction anyways, but we're just putting it up front to try to pull that out of the seller. You guys see any questions and anything else there?
Nope.
Okay, next slide. All right, there's the kind of language. Again, you'll see a big disclaimer up there that I'm not an attorney. I'm not representing this as legal language, but this kind of some standard language would be self-explanatory. All those clauses are kind of right there if you were looking for a way to write it out. We can make this document available for you to kind of just for review, for a guide. But if you ever had any doubts, you would certainly ask for legal counsel to kind of review it. And, you know, they might look and that's fine, but they would make that language a little tighter in the purchase and sale, I would suspect. Okay. Next slide, please. So there's the MARS, MAR 501 form. There's a couple different versions of it. They're all, you know, there's also the GBR form. This is the one that I use. It's pretty simple, straightforward. You can use any one, depends on, you know, I generally advise people to go with what you're most confident and competent in and comfortable in, but any of them are good. Some forms will favor the seller's side slightly in the home inspection area, and others will favor the buyer in the home inspection area. You know, some give you an opportunity in the home inspection area to put a number, an aggregate number, in a sense that if we find no problems with a house up to $5,000 worth of issues, we'll still move forward. That will be something that, you know, in one of the documents you might want to write in there to kind of strengthen your offer. But most people will put a 0 there, just for simple, obvious reasons. If the buyer doesn't like the house and there's enough issues that makes them want to walk away, they could. But I recommend you read the mortgage contingency section and the home inspection contingency section, just to understand what you are able to do after a home inspection and or a mortgage contingency. After a home inspection, you have 2 options, generally speaking. You have the option to either move forward or rescind your offer based on home inspection. If you choose, and it happens all the time, that we renegotiate some issues, buyer wants $2,000 to fix the water heater. You're actually negotiating a term in that offer. And if you're doing that, you're actually killing this offer and reconstituting a new offer. So technically, you should be rewriting the whole offer and submitting that with the understanding to the listing agent that if the seller doesn't want this or isn't willing to work with us, we respectfully ask for our deposit back. Having said that, that's what's going on, but it's been kind of a general understanding in practice that we'll have a little negotiations here, and it's up to the seller and up to the buyer. So just keep that in mind. And you also want to communicate that to the buyer and the seller so that they're aware. If you're representing the seller, let the seller know they're under no obligation to do anything. The buyer has 2 options: to move forward or ask for their money back. But if the seller is willing to compromise and pay for something, there's nothing wrong with that as well either. But do let the seller know, because some sellers they're under the understanding that, you know, that's common practice and that's normal and they kind of have to work with them. They don't have to. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the same thing would be the appraisal. If you had an appraisal that didn't come in low, doesn't mean the seller has to reduce it, and doesn't mean the buyer has to come up with the money. The buyer could certainly walk away as long as his contingency covers his deposit. Okay. Here's some thoughts just about what's going on with buyers' heads. You know, that's why you'd be using situational clauses. Buyers nervous about something, a situational clause might just put a little patch over that to help them move forward. But certainly before you put a situational clause in there, make sure the buyer's committed to the transaction. You know, ask them deep probing questions. You know, what is it that's making you uncomfortable? Handle the objection for them. Make sure they're satisfied, because if you're putting a clause in there, you know, you're actually kind of weakening the strength of your offer. Because if I'm looking at 2 offers, one's got a contingency and another one doesn't, and they're pretty close in price, I'm going with the guy who's not nervous, the guy who's more committed to buying the house. Next slide. All right, I think that's pretty much the end, more or less here. This is just kind of talking about coaching, which you both are involved in. And I would ask you one question, if you think about it. How has the coaching process been for you?
You want us to answer now?
Yeah, if you
Oh, sure. I mean, I am finding value in it because, like I mentioned to you, I can't keep asking my friends questions, and I want to feel confident and what I am doing on my own. So I certainly feel like that. And, as we discussed yesterday, definitely like that we are um, shaping the experience based on how I plan to participate in being an agent. So I'm finding a lot of value because like even this, if I called up my friend, it would take, about the same amount of time, but it wouldn't be the level of depth. And I definitely do want that handout around the 12 clauses. And then also there's some cross-pollination because my experience has only been in Rhode Island. So this is, and the rules are very similar, but nice to hear a different state perspective.
Right. So you find it in Brooke, just to be clear, you've written one offer and actually got it together, and you're going to have a closing next Friday, correct?
I have a closing Friday. I've written 3 or 4 offers. One was accepted and one was like the second best. And if that offer fell through, we could have been under contract for another one, but that didn't happen. So yeah, doing it. Thanks to you.
Oh, come on, stop.
Well, no,
You're right.
you're a great resource. So, I mean, it's helpful because you've helped me not step into some landmines is actually what I mean to say.
Right. In negotiation, sometimes it's always good to kind of run your thoughts through somebody so that you don't go and, like you said, you say landmines, but step on some toes and create tension that you don't need just by role playing the process a little bit and keeping in mind this is the launch program that we're talking about.
Yep.
Where you don't have those insights of how the listing agent might be thinking and what you can get away with, so to speak. And I think you had an example when you were negotiating, you were going to ask for a $50,000 adjustment. We had a conversation, right?
Yes.
And what happened after that
And
conversation?
so, my team agreed with you because I'm part of I'm the agent of a real estate investment group with some friends and family. It's very small, but one of my partners was like, yeah, $50,000 is ridiculous. So we went down to 30, and we were ultimately able to get 15 out of the seller.
Yeah. And ironically, didn't we talk about that? Usually you wind up somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
Yeah, almost without fail. But it's just nice to be able to run that by somebody. Listen, I felt like you guys, I don't know what to do back in the day when I didn't, you don't know what you don't know. So that's the most, but thank you for sharing that story, Brooke. And Taras, what has your experience been? Now you've written a few offers, you haven't gotten any to stick together. What are you getting out of the coaching program?
Well, I mean, I 100% agree with Brooke about everything she said. And, if I could speak to you every single day, I would, but you're busy, I'm busy. So I don't know, you guide me through the experience and you help me out, and it's very valuable, With every offer, even though some of them, well, none of them has stuck, but, I've learned a lot throughout the whole process. So, just another stone, another jab in another nail in the structure. That's the way to say it.
Right, because we're trying to build a business, not necessarily make one transaction.
Exactly. Yeah. Personally, I'm not in a rush. I do love the experience, and just great things take time. So I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate your help, all of it. Like I always say.
Good students make great teachers. So
that's
props to you guys for being a good student. And so that kind of wraps us up here. I mean, do you have any thoughts, ahas, or questions that might be persisting there?
Nothing lingering. I mean, it's useful to have gone through this a couple of times, quote unquote, blind, which is also dangerous, which is why I've engaged you. Right. But no, giving me a lot of food for thought for sure.
Awesome. Okay. So Taras, anything in closing?
No, I mean, it was like good experience, good, just kind of reassure yourself too about this class.
Okay.
But can we have this slide that you were reading? Can we have it in like a email?
We'll have Sarah share it with both of you. That way they can use it as review. Take that, what I used to do when I first started, I had that offer, call it laminated, so to speak, on both sides. And when I was writing offers, I just pulled that sucker out and just kind of went boom. And I used the calendar and just counted out days and popped it in there. And then just ask. Usually I'll always ask, because we don't want to schedule a closing when our client's going on vacation. And ironically, stuff like that's, I'm going to be away that day. well, that would have been nice to know, but
Yeah.
and same vice versa with a seller. You know, if they're not going to be in town, that would be why a closing date would make sense to people. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it. Thanks for the input. And if you know, you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to us. Obviously, I'm available to both of you as a coaching client. And if anybody else is out there and they ask you about the coaching, or, you know, would it be okay for anybody to give you guys a buzz and ask what the coaching program's all about to you?
Yeah, happy to be a reference. One last question. You mentioned you were going to do another a session on MCA or something to that effect. Have you scheduled that yet?
On CMAs,
Yes,
comparative
CMAs.
market analysis, I haven't yet.
Okay.
We've got the course kind of written, so to speak.
Okay.
But, you know, we can certainly talk more about that within our
Cool.
sessions too, if you
Yep.
need another one-on-one.
Awesome. Yep. But happy to be a reference. Cool. All right. Have a great night, folks.
All right, bye.
You
Thanks,
too.
Brooke.
Bye. Thank
Bye,
you.
Paris. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Roger. I appreciate
welcome.
you.
All right. Take
Hi,
care.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Thanks,
You too.
Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.